She said no man could love a seventh or. 3 woman. The cowboy changed her life forever. Before we begin, make sure to subscribe and hit the bell icon so you never miss our next story. The wind swept low across the wide, empty street, dragging little spirals of dust between the weathered wooden buildings. The late afternoon sun painted the entire frontier town in a gold so rich it seemed almost unreal. Yet it did little to soften the harshness of the place. Boards creaked under the weight of men leaning lazily against the fronts of the saloon and general store, their hats pulled low, eyes squinting against the light. Somewhere in the distance, the hollow clink of a hammer against metal rang from the blacksmith's shop, followed by the low bray of a mule. This was a town that had seen its share of strangers, storms, and trouble. But there was one presence here that made even the most stubborn old ranchers glance away and step aside. She stood outside the mercantile, her broad shoulders straight, her head high. From a distance, she looked carved from something harder than stone, tall beyond reason, so tall that she seemed to throw a shadow over everyone in her path. The townsfolk whispered she was 7 feet and more, and though no one had dared measure, their eyes didn't lie. Her long frame was wrapped in a simple brown work dress, worn at the hem and dusted from the road, the sleeves rolled up to reveal arms corded with quiet strength. Stray wisps of chestnut hair escaped from the knot at the back of her head, catching the light like copper thread, though the rest of her face remained fixed in an unreadable mask. A few children peeked from behind the hitching post, their giggles muffled by the palms pressed to their mouths. Their mothers called them away sharply, warning eyes darting toward the woman. Men muttered to each other under their breath. Their voices kept low, but their stares openly tracing her every move. She seemed immune to it, though perhaps it was more that she had learned to bury her reaction so deep no one could see it. With a quiet precision, she finished tying a bundle to the back of her wagon, checked the harness on the mule, and stepped back toward the mercantile door as if the whole street wasn't buzzing with her presence. She was not ugly, far from it. But there was a scale to her that unsettled people, a presence that felt out of place in a world built for smaller, quieter women. In a town where most could pass through without leaving much of a mark. She left an impression in every doorway she entered, every floorboard she crossed. The gossip was endless. Some said she had been raised in the mountains by lumbermen. Others whispered she had run away from a circus. A few, with cruel smirks, joked that she was the reason no single man had settled down here in years. Inside the saloon, the talk followed her even when she wasn't in sight. "Big as a draft horse, that one," a ranch hand would mutter over his drink. "Would take 2 men just to dance with her." Someone else would chuckle, shaking his head as though it were all a grand joke. But there was an edge to it, not just mockery, but discomfort. She didn't belong, and in small towns like this, that alone was enough to keep her apart. She spoke to no one unless she had to, kept her errands brief, and left the moment her business was done. Some believed she had no feelings at all. But those who had caught a glimpse of her eyes, dark, steady, carrying something unspoken, might have thought otherwise. Perhaps she had been hurt too many times to let anyone close. Perhaps it was easier to stand alone than to keep reaching for hands that were always pulled away. This day was like any other, or at least it began that way. She had collected her supplies, the mule was restless in its harness, and the street lay in the heavy heat of late afternoon. Then, from the far end of town, the slow, steady rhythm of hoofbeats broke through the low hum of the place. A single rider appeared, the outline of his figure shimmering in the dusty light. He was tall in the saddle, shoulders squared, wearing a coat that had seen long miles and a hat that threw his face into shadow. The townsfolk turned to watch as he came closer. Strangers were not rare, but they were always a cause for interest. Some measured him up as a potential threat, others as a curiosity. He rode with an easy confidence, the kind of man who seemed unhurried but aware of every eye on him. His horse was a lean bay, dust clinging to its flanks, its bridle worn but well cared for. He reined in near the hitching post across from the mercantile, swinging down with the kind of smooth movement that comes from years in the saddle. Boots hit the dirt, spurs catching the light. As he looped the reins over the post, his gaze lifted and found her. For a moment, neither moved. The noise of the street faded under the sudden weight of that look. He didn't glance away, as so many others did. Instead, his eyes held hers, not with the boldness of a challenge, but with the steady curiosity of someone seeing a thing worth seeing. The corner of his mouth twitched. Not quite a smile, not quite a frown. She held his gaze for a breath longer than she meant to, her fingers still resting on the wagon rail. Then, with a flicker of something in her expression, confusion perhaps, or annoyance at herself, she broke the connection and stepped up into the wagon seat. The mule shifted, ready to move. He watched as she guided the animal forward, the wagon rolling past him in a low rumble of wheels over dirt. And though the townsfolk resumed their mutters, and the saloon door creaked open to spill more men into the street, the stranger's eyes stayed on her retreating figure until she was nothing more than a tall silhouette against the glowing horizon, in a town where most had long since decided what to think of her. It was the first time in years someone had looked at her as though they hadn't already made up their mind. The stranger's name was Jack Callahan, though no one in town knew that yet. He was the kind of man who didn't announce himself, letting the rhythm of his boots and the quiet weight of his presence speak first. That morning, he'd tied his horse outside the boarding house and stepped into the slow life of the town, with a purpose that was neither hurried nor idle. He'd come looking for work, the kind of steady ranch work that paid enough to keep a man moving and his horse fed. The main street was already awake with its usual hum. Wagons creaking, merchants calling out to the few customers drifting by, the clang of the blacksmith's hammer punctuating the air. As he walked toward the saloon, eyes followed him, not with suspicion so much as curiosity. In a small place like this, everyone noticed a new face. Jack knew how that went. He'd seen it in every town from the Rio Grande to the High Plains. Inside, the saloon was dim after the brightness outside, its air thick with the smell of whiskey and wood smoke. A few men sat scattered at tables, their hats tilted back, voices low. Jack ordered a coffee. It was too early for him to take a drink, and listened without looking like he was listening. That was a habit of his. You learned more by keeping your eyes down and your ears open. The talk, as it happened, turned to her. "You see the giantess this morning?" one man said, his voice half amusement, half disbelief. "Swear she's taller than the door frame at the mercantile." Another chuckled, slapping the table. "Bigger than any man in this town, that's for sure. No wonder she's alone. Ain't a man alive could, well, you know." His words trailed off into the kind of laughter that was meant to be shared at someone else's expense. Jack took a slow sip of his coffee. He'd heard enough variations of that tone to know what it was. Cruelty dressed up as humor. He didn't care for it. He didn't know her story, but he knew what it was like to have folks decide who you were before they'd spoken a word to you. He let the talk pass without joining in, his expression giving nothing away. Later that afternoon, as he stepped out of the saloon, the light hit him hard again, making him squint until his eyes adjusted. The street had thinned out, only a few wagons moving slow along the packed dirt. That's when he saw her again. She was coming up the street from the direction of the post office, a parcel under one arm, her long stride making short work of the distance. People stepped aside as she approached, some pretending to be busy with shop windows, others outright crossing to the other side. She didn't seem to notice. Or perhaps she'd learned long ago not to show that she did. Jack found himself holding the saloon door a moment longer than necessary, watching her. And then, as if the moment had been laid out for him, she passed close enough that the parcel she carried slipped against her hip and tumbled toward the ground. He stepped forward without thinking, catching it before it could hit the dirt. "You dropped this," he said, his voice even, offering it back. She stopped, looking at him fully for the first time in daylight. Her eyes were darker than he'd expected, deep and steady, as if measuring him in the span of a single heartbeat. "Thank you," she said. And the words were simple, unadorned. She took the parcel from his hands, her long fingers brushing briefly against his. Most men, she knew, would have looked away by now, discomfort written plain in their posture. But he didn't. He stood there, hat tipped just enough to shade his eyes, meeting her gaze as if there were nothing unusual about her towering above him. She shifted her weight slightly, unsure whether to continue the exchange or end it. Finally, she gave the smallest nod, turned and continued on her way. Jack watched her go, noting the straight line of her back, the way she moved as though every step was part of some quiet vow to herself. That evening, Jack walked the length of town to a small ranch on the outskirts where he'd heard that there might be work. The place was run by an older couple, the Tanners, who were more than happy to have an extra set of hands for the late summer cattle work. By the time the deal was struck, the sun was low and the shadows long across the fields. On his way back into town, he passed the mercantile again. Through the open doorway, he saw her, the tall woman, at the counter, speaking in a low voice to the shopkeeper. She was counting coins into her palm, her expression unchanged, even when the clerk barely looked at her. Something in the set of her jaw told Jack she was used to that kind of treatment. When she turned to leave, their eyes met again across the street. This time, there was no dropped parcel to excuse the moment, no words to fill the space between them. But there was something there. Not quite familiarity, but not the blank distance of strangers either. She looked at him a fraction longer than was polite, then moved on. Disappearing into the evening light, Jack stood there a moment longer than he should have, his hat brim low over his eyes, before heading back to the boarding house. He told himself it was nothing, just the natural curiosity one might have for anyone the entire town seemed to talk about. But as he lay on the narrow bed that night, staring at the shadowed ceiling, he found that he could still picture her exactly as she'd looked when she took that parcel from his hands. It wasn't just her height that had set her apart in his mind. It was the way she carried it, as if she knew the whole world had already made up its mind about her. And she'd decided to live anyway. The day began like any other in the dusty little town, the sun stretching long fingers of heat across the prairie. By mid-morning, a low wind stirred, kicking grit across the main street. The cowboy had spent the morning helping an old rancher repair a corral fence when the sudden clamor of shouting caught his ear. He turned toward the source, the freight yard by the livery stable, and saw a wagon tilted at a sharp angle. One wheel snapped clean off. The mule hitched to it was panicking, kicking up dust and straining against the harness. Standing beside the wreck was the towering woman he'd glimpsed days earlier. Her long arms stretched toward the frightened animal, her voice low but firm. She looked entirely focused, unaware of the gathering crowd. The cowboy didn't hesitate. Dropping his hammer, he jogged over, boots pounding against the dry earth. The closer he got, the more the scene revealed itself. A load of heavy grain sacks had shifted when the wheel broke, nearly toppling the wagon. The mule's eyes rolled white, the harness straps pulling tight across its chest. The woman had her massive hands on the bridle, speaking in calm, measured tones, trying to keep the animal from bolting. But every time the mule lunged, the wagon shifted dangerously. Without a word, the cowboy stepped into the fray, grabbing the harness on the other side. Their eyes met for a split second. Her gaze was sharp, startled, but she didn't object. Together, they steadied the mule. He matched her movements, keeping the animal's head low while she untangled the straps with surprising dexterity. There was a quiet authority to her, a kind of strength that wasn't just in her size, but in the way she handled the chaos. Once the mule calmed, the cowboy moved to inspect the broken wheel. "That axle's split," he muttered, crouching low. "I know," she replied, her deep voice even but clipped. "Need to get the load off before it tips." The crowd that had gathered did little more than gawk. Whispers floated on the wind. Remarks about her height, her voice, the way she looked next to him. Most folks in town didn't dare get too close to her, and now they stood back, watching as the two strangers worked in tandem. The cowboy began unloading the grain sacks, each one heavy, but she lifted them as though they were nothing more than firewood. They moved quickly, communicating with short glances and nods. When the last sack was clear, the cowboy set to work with the tools from his saddlebag. She knelt beside him, steadying the axle so he could wedge the splintered wood into place, enough to move the wagon. Her hands were large, scarred from years of hard labor, but her touch was careful, precise. "You've done this before," he said without looking up. "Wagons break more than people think," she answered. "Most don't know how to fix them." He smiled faintly, though she didn't see it. Her voice carried none of the boastfulness he might have expected. Only fact, plain and simple. Within an hour, they had the wagon upright and the mule calm. The crowd, having seen all they came for, began to disperse, their murmurs fading into the distance. Still, the cowboy noticed the glances being traded among them. This little incident would fuel another round of gossip, no doubt. When the work was done, she wiped her hands on the front of her skirt and turned toward him. For the first time, there was something in her expression that wasn't guarded. Not exactly a smile, but softer than before. "Thank you," she said quietly. He tipped his hat. "You looked like you had it handled." "Maybe," she replied, tilting her head slightly. "But sometimes it's good not to handle things alone." The words lingered in his mind as she stepped up into the wagon seat and took the reins. The mule, now calm, pulled away slowly. He watched her go, the tall frame of her body outlined against the wide, empty street. There was something about her. Something the whispers didn't explain. She wasn't the cold, dangerous figure the townsfolk made her out to be. She was strong, yes, but there was a quiet kindness in her movements, a patience in the way she had calmed the mule. Later that evening, he overheard two men at the saloon muttering about the incident. "That big woman, don't know what he was doing helping her. Ain't right," one said. The cowboy kept his eyes on his drink, but he felt the words prick at him. People were quick to talk, but none of them had been willing to step forward when it mattered. As he walked back to his small rented room above the mercantile, the image of her lifting those grain sacks without breaking a sweat stayed with him. There was more to her story, He could feel it. And now, more than ever, he wanted to know what it was. The rain came down in a slow, steady curtain, drumming against the tin roof of the old barn. The air smelled of damp hay and horse musk, the kind of scent that lingered in the lungs and made everything feel a little closer, a little heavier. The cowboy pushed the door closed behind him, shaking the rain off his hat before setting it on a nearby post. Inside, shadows danced with the flicker of a single lantern, its light throwing long golden streaks across the stacked hay bales. In the loft above, he could hear the soft rustle of movement. She was there, sitting with her back against a beam, knees drawn up, staring at nothing in particular. For a moment, he thought about leaving her be, but something about the way she sat, shoulders hunched, yet still somehow unyielding, pulled him forward. The floor creaked under his boots as he climbed the ladder, each step slow, deliberate. She didn't look up until he was almost beside her, and even then, her eyes flickered only briefly before returning to the shadows. "You all right?" he asked quietly, settling himself on the hay a respectful distance away. She gave a short, humorless laugh. "You know what folks say about me?" Her voice was low, but it carried a weight that felt older than she was. "They don't even whisper it anymore. They just say it, out loud, like I ain't standing right there." He waited. He'd learned long ago that silence could do more to open someone up than any quick comfort could. "They call me too much. Too tall, too big, too strange. Say I'll never find a husband because no man wants to stand next to someone who could look him straight in the eye, even when he's on a step." Her gaze drifted toward him, and for a heartbeat, he thought she might cry. But no tears came. Just a tired sort of defiance. 7 feet, 3 inches. Ain't a dress in this territory that fits me right. Ain't a man who's ever looked at me without that flicker in his eyes, that mix of awe and discomfort. The cowboy shifted, resting his elbows on his knees. Maybe they just don't know what they're looking at. She turned her head slowly, brows lifting. "And you do?" "I see someone who works harder than most men in this town. Someone who ain't afraid to stand tall, even when folks are trying to cut her down." His voice was steady, almost too calm, as if the words weren't meant to flatter but to simply state a fact. Her lips pressed into a thin line. "It ain't about work. It's about feeling like there's something wrong with you, like you're built all wrong for the world you're in." She glanced at the open rafters above, the rain still pattering against the roof. "I tried once, to fit. Bent myself smaller, spoke softer, wore dresses that hurt to breathe in. But no matter what I did, I was still the giant. Still, the woman who could carry a sack of grain like it was a feather. That don't make a man feel needed." The lantern's flame wavered, as if reacting to the words hanging in the air. He let out a slow breath. "Maybe you just been looking for the wrong kind of man." That made her laugh. A small, surprised sound, almost fragile. "And you? Which kind are you?" He didn't answer right away. His eyes held hers in the warm lamplight. "The kind that don't look away." The barn seemed quieter after that, the rain outside softening to a gentle hiss. She studied him for a long moment, and something in her expression shifted. Not quite trust, but the beginning of it. The hard edges in her posture eased. Her hands, which had been curled into the fabric of her skirt, slowly loosened. "I never told anyone all that before," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. He smiled faintly, but didn't push. "Guess the hayloft's got a way of keeping secrets." A gust of wind rattled the barn doors below, and she glanced toward the ladder. "You should get home before it gets worse." He shook his head. "Reckon I'll wait till the rain lets up. Don't mind the company." She looked at him then. Really looked. And for the first time, she didn't see the same flicker she'd grown used to in other men's eyes. No discomfort, no patronizing pity, just steady warmth. As if he saw her exactly as she was, without asking her to shrink or stretch to fit. The lantern light softened around them. And in the stillness, she realized something dangerous. She didn't want him to leave. The rain had begun just after sundown, a steady drumming on the tin roof that echoed through the barn in a rhythm that felt almost like a heartbeat. The horses shifted restlessly in their stalls, hooves clopping against the wooden floor, while the scent of hay and damp earth mingled in the cool night air. He had come to check on the animals, making sure the storm hadn't startled them too badly, when he noticed her, sitting on the edge of the hayloft, one long leg hanging down, the other bent at the knee, her face half lit by the dim lantern glow. For once, she wasn't wearing the hard, guarded expression the town always saw. Instead, there was something quieter about her, softer, as if the storm had stripped away the armor she carried every day. He hesitated at first, not wanting to intrude. But when she glanced down at him, her eyes didn't carry the usual warning that told others to keep their distance. Instead, she nodded toward the ladder. "Might as well come up. No use standing there like you're about to get scolded." Her voice had a tired warmth to it, and he climbed up without another word, the rungs creaking beneath his boots. When he reached the top, he noticed she wasn't hiding behind her size the way she sometimes did, folding herself smaller as though trying not to take up space. Tonight, she seemed unguarded. She sat there, knees drawn in slightly, hands resting loosely over them, watching the rain through a gap in the barn siding. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The air between them felt thick, but not with discomfort, more like an unspoken understanding. "You ever notice?" she began, her gaze fixed on the dark field beyond. "How rain has a way of making everything look the same. Doesn't matter if it's a shack or a mansion, when the waters." The air in town was buzzing that Saturday evening, carrying the mingled scents of wood smoke, fresh-baked bread, and anticipation. The community hall, a weathered but sturdy building at the end of Main Street, had been strung with lanterns that cast a warm amber glow through the dusty windows. Music drifted out from within, the lilting notes of a fiddle and the rhythmic thump of a bass drum rolling across the quiet night. People came from miles around for these gatherings. Ranch hands with fresh-shined boots, shopkeepers with their Sunday-best coats, wives with ribbons in their hair. And, like clockwork, the gossip that always came with them. Tonight would be no exception, though the focus of their whispers had yet to arrive. He stood outside the hall for a long moment, hat in hand, his mind playing through what he was about to do. The thought of her sitting alone in her little house, pretending she didn't know the dance was happening, sat heavy in his chest. It wasn't right. He'd been to enough of these to know that the same faces circled the floor, the same laughter and small talk floating over the same tunes. But she'd never been among them. And everyone liked to pretend it was her choice. He knew better. So, with a decisive nod, he saddled up, rode out past the last lamplight of town, and headed toward her place. When she opened the door, her expression was half confused, half guarded. She was wearing her work dress, sleeves rolled to the elbow, hair loosely tied back. "What are you doing here?" she asked, voice a touch defensive. "There's a dance in town," he said plainly, "and I came to take you to it." Her brow furrowed, almost like she was trying to decipher a joke. "You know what people will say?" she murmured, glancing past him toward the road. "Let 'em say it," he replied. "They've been talking for years, and it hasn't done you a lick of good hiding from it." She looked down at her hands, then back at him. "I don't own anything. Fine enough for that kind of thing." He gave a little shrug. "Then we'll go as we are." There was something in the calm certainty of his tone that made refusal harder than she expected. After a pause, she went to fetch her shawl. When they arrived at the hall, conversation inside faltered for a moment, just long enough to be noticed. Heads turned, eyes narrowed, lips pursed in quiet speculation. She felt the heat rise to her face, every inch of her towering frame feeling somehow even taller under their collective gaze. But he walked in, as though nothing at all was amiss, offering her his arm and leading her straight toward the open floor where couples were circling in time to the music. "Evenin', folks," he said cheerfully, tipping his hat toward a few familiar faces. Some nodded back, others stared with thinly veiled curiosity. The first notes of a slower song began, and he turned to her. "May I have this dance?" She hesitated, glancing at the people lining the walls, but his hand remained steady, palm up, waiting. Finally, she placed her hand in his, and they stepped onto the worn wooden boards. At first, her movements were stiff, her gaze flickering nervously to the onlookers. She could hear their murmurs, too faint to make out exact words, but heavy with meaning. Her shoulders tensed, but then she looked at him. He wasn't looking at them. He wasn't even pretending they weren't there. He was looking directly at her, eyes warm, a faint smile tugging at the corner of his mouth as though the entire room had vanished. And in that moment, it might as well have. The fiddle's tune wound its way through the room like a ribbon in the breeze, and gradually her steps began to match his, with ease. He moved with a quiet confidence, guiding her through each turn without a single misstep, his hand at the small of her back steady and sure. For the first time in years, she wasn't thinking about how much taller she was than her partner, or how others saw her. She was simply there, in the music, in his presence. By the second song, something shifted. Her laughter, small and hesitant at first, bubbled up when he made a playful spin, catching her as she nearly stumbled. A few people watching looked away quickly, as if realizing their stares were obvious. Others kept watching, but she no longer felt the weight of it pressing on her chest. During a break between songs, they stepped to the side where a table of lemonade and biscuits stood. A few brave townsfolk approached, offering polite greetings. Mrs. Calloway, the postmaster's wife, even remarked, "You look lovely tonight, dear," though her tone carried a note of surprise that wasn't entirely flattering. Still, it was more civility than she'd expected. "They'll talk about this for a week," she said quietly to him as they sipped their drinks. "Then we'll give him something worth talking about," he replied. And before she could answer, the music started up again, and he was pulling her back toward the floor. This time, the dance was faster, boots stomping in rhythm, skirts swirling in the lamplight. He didn't let go of her hand even between the figures, leading her with a kind of easy joy that made her forget, for stretches at a time, that anyone else was in the room at all. By the time the music finally slowed and the evening began winding down, she found herself reluctant to leave the floor. Outside, the night air was cool and clear, the stars sharp against the black sky. Lanterns still glowed in the windows, but the sounds of music and chatter had softened. They stood for a moment by his horse, neither in a hurry to speak. Finally, she said, I haven't danced in... I don't even remember how long. You should, he said simply. You're good at it. She gave a small, almost shy smile. You didn't mind that everyone was looking? I wasn't looking at them, he answered, and neither should you. For the first time in years, her heart felt light. Not just from the music, but from the realization that someone had chosen to see her for more than the whispers that followed her name. As they rode back toward the quiet edge of town, the memory of the dance still warm between them, she found herself wondering what other firsts he might bring into her life. And in the stillness of the night, under the endless sweep of the prairie sky, she realized she didn't dread finding out. The next morning, the air in town felt heavier, as though the rumors about them had thickened into a fog that clung to every corner. Word of their dance had traveled faster than wildfire on dry grass. Some folks whispered behind their hands. Others stared openly when the cowboy walked past. He kept his head high, tipping his hat in polite acknowledgement, as if the weight of their judgment couldn't touch him. But she noticed it. From her window above the general store, she saw the way the townsfolk leaned in to mutter when he crossed the street, and she could feel the sting of every glance they cast toward her. The warmth from that night on the dance floor was still in her chest, but it fought for space against a creeping dread. She had lived with gossip all her life, but now the words were sharper, aimed not only at her, but at him. It happened just before noon. The sun was high, casting short, hard shadows across the dusty main road. He was heading toward the blacksmith's to check on a horseshoe repair when a voice, dripping with mockery, called out from the other side of the street. "Hey, cowboy! Didn't know you liked your women. Bigger than you could handle." The drawl came from a rival ranch hand, a man with a reputation for trouble and a smirk that had never meant anything good. He leaned casually against a hitching post, but his eyes glittered with challenge. A few townsfolk stopped mid-step, sensing what might be about to happen. The cowboy slowed, then turned. His hand rested lightly on the buckle of his belt, not yet reaching for the Colt at his side, but the shift in his stance spoke volumes. The street seemed to grow quieter, the sound of a far-off hammer in the blacksmith shop punctuating the silence. "You got something to say? Then say it plain," the cowboy said, his voice steady, low, and dangerous. The ranch hand chuckled, pushing himself upright and sauntering forward. "Just thinking it's mighty funny you'd waste your time on a woman who..." His words stopped dead when the cowboy stepped closer, his eyes hard enough to cut through steel. "You best be careful how you finish that sentence," the cowboy warned, his tone leaving no room for misunderstanding. The two men stood barely a yard apart now, the tension snapping in the air like a live wire. Murmurs rippled through the small crowd that had gathered, and somewhere a horse stamped nervously, sensing the heat between them. The rival ranch hand glanced around, as if to make sure he still had an audience, then sneered. "Guess you're the type that don't mind a challenge." The insult was weak compared to what he had intended, and everyone knew it. The cowboy's jaw flexed, but instead of reaching for his gun, he leaned in slightly and said, "She's worth more than you'll ever understand. And if I hear you talk about her again, you'll be picking your teeth up off this street." The man blinked, taken aback, and for a heartbeat, it seemed he might push the matter further. But something in the cowboy's eyes, that unyielding steadiness, the kind that comes from knowing exactly who you are and what you'll stand for, made him think better of it. He spat into the dust, muttered something under his breath, and walked away, his bravado crumbling with each step. The small crowd dispersed, a few nodding in silent approval, others shaking their heads as if the cowboy had just marked himself for trouble. From her vantage point, she had seen it all. She had come downstairs when she heard the voices rise and had stopped just inside the saloon doorway, hidden enough to watch without being noticed. Her heart had been pounding, not from fear of violence, but from the realization of what he had just done. Men had defended her before, in small, polite ways. A door held open, a half-hearted, "That's enough," tossed at an unkind comment. But no one had ever stood up in the middle of town, in front of everyone, and declared without shame that she mattered. It was both terrifying and something else. Something that made her feel taller in a way that had nothing to do with her height. That evening, when the rain began to fall in slow, steady drops, she found herself restless. She stepped onto the porch of her small rented room and saw him walking down the street toward the livery. Without thinking, she called out his name. He stopped, turned, and tipped his hat, waiting. "I saw what you did today," she said, her voice carrying just enough to reach him over the sound of the rain on the rooftops. He didn't smile, didn't play it off with a joke. "Didn't do nothing special," he replied. "Just told the truth." Her breath caught, not because of the words themselves, but because of the way he said them, as if her worth were as obvious and undeniable as the ground under their boots. For a moment, she didn't know what to say. She had spent so long keeping her guard up, so long believing that people's kindness came with conditions. But here he was, drenched in rain, looking at her like there was nothing in the world complicated about how he felt. As he walked away, she stayed there, listening to the rain and replaying the scene in her mind. The standoff in the street had left its mark on her, not just because he defended her, but because he hadn't hesitated. In a world where hesitation often meant everything, that alone made her start to believe he might truly mean what he hadn't yet said out loud. The afternoon sun hung low over the town, painting the dusty street in shades of gold and shadow. People milled about lazily, going about their day, until the cowboy's voice cut through the usual hum of conversation. He stood in the middle of the street, boots planted firm, his hat pushed back slightly so everyone could see his face. The tall woman stood a few feet away, her long shadow stretching across the boards of the general store's porch. She had not expected him to call her name, let alone in front of half the town. But when she turned, there was something in his eyes that made her forget the watching crowd. "You need to hear this," he said, his voice deep and steady, carrying over the quiet. His tone wasn't the kind of boast men used in the saloon, nor the sharp bark of a man defending his pride. It was earnest, raw, and strong. The townsfolk stilled, some leaning on porch railings, others pausing mid-step, sensing a spectacle. She stood frozen, her heart pounding, her hands gripping the edge of her shawl. She'd spent her life shrinking away from attention, and now every gaze in the street was fixed on her. "I love you," he said, the words ringing like a hammer strike in the silence. A few gasps cut through the air. It wasn't just the blunt honesty of the confession. It was who he was saying it to. She, the woman who had been whispered about in every corner, whose height and frame had been the subject of cruel jokes and quiet pity. He, the cowboy with a reputation for grit and charm, could have had any woman in the county. And yet, here he was, declaring himself in the open with no shame in his eyes. Her chest tightened, and for a heartbeat, she could not breathe. She wanted to run, to escape the staring faces, but his gaze held her steady. "I don't care what anyone says," he went on, his voice rising. "I don't care about the stares, the talk, the names they've called you. I see you, and I've never met a braver, kinder, or more beautiful woman in my life." There was a murmur in the crowd, a shifting of feet. Some looked down, ashamed, while others kept their arms crossed, skeptical. But the weight of his words was undeniable. And for the first time, she saw hesitation in the faces that had once been so quick to judge. Her throat felt dry as she stepped toward him. The distance between them closed slowly, each step echoing in her ears. When she stopped in front of him, she could see the faint glint of nerves in his eyes. But his stance never wavered. Rain or shine, feast or famine, he looked like a man who meant every word. "You don't have to say anything now," he murmured, softer so only she could hear. "But I needed you to know." The tension in her chest broke like a dam. "You're a fool," she whispered, though her voice trembled with something that wasn't anger. "But maybe you're my kind of fool." His grin was slow, spreading across his face like the warmth of a morning sun. And in that moment, she didn't care who was watching. She reached up, her long fingers brushing the side of his face, and the crowd let out an audible stir. A few in the town smiled faintly, others turned away, muttering. But no one could pretend they hadn't seen what just happened. Something in the air shifted. Not a full acceptance, but a crack in the wall of prejudice that had stood for years, and cracks had a way of spreading. By the time they walked back to the ranch that evening, the tension of the moment had settled into a quiet peace. The sky above was painted in streaks of pink and violet, the smell of sage and dust mingling with the cool breeze. She walked beside him, their steps falling in an easy rhythm. Neither of them spoke much, but every so often their hands brushed, and neither pulled away. When they reached the barn, the first stars were beginning to glimmer in the darkening sky. He leaned against the doorframe, watching her as she untied her shawl. "You still think no man could love you?" he asked gently. She paused, her fingers resting on the fabric, and looked at him. "I'm starting to think I've been wrong about a lot of things," she said, her lips curving into a faint, uncertain smile. Inside the barn, the horses shifted quietly in their stalls. He stepped forward, taking her hand, big enough to match his, warm from the day's work, and led her toward the open pasture. They stood side by side, watching the night settle over the land, the ranch stretching out before them like a promise. For years, she had imagined a life spent alone, hiding in the edges of the world. Now, with his hand in hers, the horizon looked different, wider, brighter, and filled with possibility. Somewhere deep inside, the old belief still whispered that this couldn't last, that the world wouldn't allow it. But for tonight, under the starlit sky and with the steady beat of his heart against hers, she let herself believe. The future was uncertain, but the present was undeniable. And for the first time in her life, she felt tall in a way that had nothing to do with height.